What are the important defensive layers in Last Epoch aside from life and res? First things first, let's talk about life and res, right? So life, whenever I've been mapping out my characters in like lastepochtools.com, it feels like about 2,000 life is the threshold where my characters hit about 2,000 life. So real quick, res, we talked about this before. Res is less important. Capping your res is less important in Last Epoch than it is in PoE because of how penetration works, right? Bloop. Your resistance kind of looks like this, right? So you can imagine like if you had 100% resistance and you were moving like from 100% res down to 99% res, you're like exponentially increasing how much damage you take because you're going from taking 0 damage to taking, any damage at all. And then if you go from 99 res to 98 res, you're taking twice as much damage, right? So in Path of Exile, you start at 75 res right here, which means that if you drop 1 res, you're increasing, that percent damage you're taking, right? Because all monsters have 75% penetration, in Last Epoch, you're starting right here instead of starting up here. So if you have, less resistance, if you're moving from 75% res in Last Epoch to 74% res, let's make this a 4, to 74% res in Last Epoch, you are not punished nearly as much, which is why sometimes you'll see people not really care about their poison res. So poison res, for the most part in Last Epoch, mitigates poison pools and AoE on the ground, and you could just not step in them. Leaving your poison res like 30 or 40 or 50 isn't really that punishing. I'm going to end up capping this because I'm playing it hardcore, but if you're only like 30 or 40, it's not that punishing. There is a curse called Marked for Death. So like if you like technically want to be as tanky as possible, then all of your resistances should be at 100, right? Because 100 would be 75 plus 25 from the Marked for Death. What are the other things that you can do for resistances? Here's your additional defenses tab, right? Like Last Epoch just gives all this information for you. So how does armor work? Armor is, I think armor is more interesting in Last Epoch than it is in Path of Exile. And I'm going to continue comparing these things because I know like a lot of people in chat right now are Path of Exile players. So armor in this game, it mitigates everything other than damage over time. And when I say everything, I don't only mean phys, I mean everything. So armor mitigates physical damage at 100% of its value, but it also mitigates other types of damage at 70% value. So you can see that by like hovering over this, right? So like I have virtually no armor in my character, but my armor mitigates an average of 3 damage from a hit. And this average is calculated from like, my character level and like the monoliths that I'm fighting in. So against non-physical damage, like if somebody hits me with like a bolt of lightning, I'm mitigating 2% of that instead of 3% of that. So sometimes you'll see things that say like, maybe you'll find an idol or like a chess piece modifier that says 50% of void damage taken as physical damage. And if you're familiar with Path of Exile, that sounds backward. That sounds like the wrong thing to do. But because of how armor works, because armor mitigates at a higher value against phys damage, well, if something with void damage hits you, your armor is 70% as effective. If something hits you with void damage and you receive it as physical damage, then all of a sudden your armor is more effective. So that's kind of what armor is doing for you in this game, right? Let's go on to block, because block is pretty sweet, right? So block, again, compare this to Path of Exile. In PoE, if you have a shield that has 20 block and you roll that 1 in 5 to block something, you take 0 damage. In this game, in Last Epoch, that is not how it works. You can cap your block at 100%. Now, the thing that's limited is block effectiveness. So there's only block chance. There's no spell block chance. It's just normal block chance. It only works against hits. It doesn't work against damage over time. But your block chance can go all the way up to 100%. You can block every single hit. Your block effectiveness is capped at 85%. So even if you have 100% block chance, you can only block up to 85% of the damage from any given hit. But yeah, this block effectiveness, this is an important stat for like, okay, if you're going to have a sizable bit of block chance, you're going to want some block effectiveness that goes into it as well. Dodge, I think dodge got nerfed at some point. So dodge is associated with dexterity. Remember, every 1 point of dexterity gives you 4 points of dodge. If you're playing a rogue, maybe you'll be speccing into dodge as well. But dodge is all about like just not getting hit at all, right? It's like block and block effectiveness rolled into one. It's just a chance to take 0 damage, a chance to not be hit by whatever it is, right? The effect didn't get nerfed. The effect of dodge didn't get nerfed. It's just harder to get a good amount of dodge unless you're rogue. Okay, gotcha. All right, what else? We can talk about ward as well. So we played a couple characters that are based on ward. I have no ward on this character. I guess I could load up a different character perhaps. We'll see about that. So ward it's kind of like energy shield from Path of Exile, but instead of having a maximum where you start at the maximum, it's a measure of how much ward you're generating versus how much ward you're losing over time. So there's no maximum to it. It's just a matter of like how much you have. Let's see if I can load up a character here real quick. Oh, I'm wearing an Exsanguinous. Okay, so we loaded up a character here that has some ward built into it. So you can see like my normal health is 670, but I have like this 680 or 786. Ward always decays over time. So we can just read the text off, right? Ward absorbs damage before health. It has no cap and it decays over time. Decay for ward occurs more quickly the more ward you have. So it's hard to get like a huge amount of ward, right? So right now we're getting all of our ward from this chest piece called Exsanguinous. 20% of missing health gained as ward per second. So it's not gained as ward, it's gained as ward per second, right? So we're generating all this ward and we're generating exactly 686 of it before the decay starts to kick in and means that we can't generate anymore. What else matters in terms of defense? So endurance is the yellow text on the very bottom left of the screen. It does apply to you getting one shot. So even though like the damage started out above your endurance threshold, it's still going to apply below your endurance threshold. So endurance by default is 20% damage reduction. It's kind of like a fortify that only turns on when you're at low life, right? So once you're at low life, your fortified turns on and you take 20% less damage. So the threshold, it's the yellow bar on my health globe here. The threshold is currently at 247, and you can get endurance as a suffix on your gear. You can also get it from blessings, from like Hayrot and stuff like that, but your endurance can be as high as you want. You could have 800 endurance, right? You could get tons of endurance. You could get this yellow bar to cover, your entire health globe. And then you would always have 20% damage reduction. The 20% also goes up. So instead of 20% endurance, you could have 60% endurance. So let's pop this open on the game guide here, right? Endurance, spelled correctly. Endurance is capped at 60%. Let's see if we can find that here. Yep. Endurance is capped at 60% less damage taken. So we start at 20, and then we can stack it up to 60. And then once we have 60, we can stack up flat endurance, and that'll raise that yellow bar more and more and more, so it covers more of our health. We could try doing this on our current character. So our current character uses Reaper form. Let's turn this on. And then we also have our regen from Aura of Decay. And then we can use Death Seal. And one of the reasons that Death Seal is so interesting is that once we pop this, we go down to 1/3 of our life total. And we have this great visual effect that goes off. And we are now very, very close to our endurance threshold. So even though like we become low life, we gain, 20% damage reduction the entire time. So maybe for this current build, we'll use some of the suffixes on our gear and we'll stack up percent endurance up to 60%. And maybe we'll stack like maybe another 100, maybe another 150 flat endurance to make sure that we're always covered the entire time while we have Death Seal active. Speaking of endurance, I said that the third thing we're going to talk about in regards to your health globe is mind over matter. So it's not called mind over matter. It's not called anything in this game, but if you're familiar with Path of Exile, then you know what mind over matter is. In this game, it's called damage taken from mana before life. Before health, is that it? Damage dealt to mana before health. And you see it's sorted here under mage. Is mage the only class that has access to this? Or do other classes also have access to this? Only mage has access to it. So mage is one of the 5 starting classes. Apparently they're the only one who has access to this, but you can play like a mind over matter character. The reason that I want to call this out is that when you're at an endurance threshold, if that damage is dealt to your mana, it's also affected by endurance. So if you're a mage, if you're doing this mind over matter stuff with damage dealt to mana before health, your endurance is still a valuable component to you because the damage is considered as under your endurance threshold, the endurance takes place and then that damage is dealt to your mana. Does So that's kind of a cool way of scaling your defenses as well. All right, so we were talking briefly about defenses. Crit avoid. Oh man, did I miss crit avoid? There we go. I totally missed crit avoid. So crit avoid is in your defenses tab. If you click C by default on your keyboard, in your defenses, you'll see critical strike avoidance, and I've got 11%, but I've got this excellent chess piece, which puts me at 111%. So crit avoidance means that you have a chance to avoid all of the extra damage done to you by a critical strike. So if normally the damage would be like 100 damage, but the crit damage brings it up to like, you know, 1,000,000 damage. If you have 100% crit avoidance, you're only going to take the 100 damage. So all of the extra damage from crits disappears. Crit avoid is not so important during the storyline. It's not so important at the beginning of doing monoliths, but by the time that you're transitioning into empowered monoliths, which is probably like around maybe like level 80, maybe like level 85, at least in my experience, at that point, you're going to want enough crit avoidance on your gear, on like your suffixes here, or maybe like an implicit somewhere, or maybe there's a blessing that you have somewhere, but you're going to want enough crit avoidance to cap yourself over 100%. The reason for that is that while you're doing your monoliths, the monoliths themselves, they have like 100% increased critical strike chance, enemies have plus 10 base critical strike chance, and all of those modifiers stack. So while you're like making your way through the monolith web, going from this node to this node to this node, you need to have things that aren't so dangerous. If all you're doing is stacking up monster life, monster damage, monster life, monster damage, monster life, you're gonna die. Like, yeah, it's really dangerous stacking up that much damage when you're in empowered monoliths. But if you can like path through a free node that isn't really a big deal to your character, well, crit chance is a really good free node to give yourself. This thing here, this unique item, I want to call it out. I call this item Tabula Rasa. This is a unique item that drops from the very first boss in your very first monolith. It's a very common drop. It doesn't always drop from him, but it's a very common drop from him. All of my characters that I play in hardcore, if I get lucky enough to get this woven flesh, I just put this thing on until I have enough crit avoidance on the rest of my gear that I can take it off. You don't need to do that in softcore. It's not mandatory, but I find it so easy just to slap this thing on. And then once I get to like level 80 or 85, once the rest of my gear kind of catches up, you know, I can swap this out and put on a real chest piece instead. All right, so someone in chat just reminded me of this. Let's touch on this as well. When I was new to Last Epoch, I did not value these very highly. There are some suffixes that roll on your weapons that don't really give you damage, but they're going to give you like ways of CCing your enemies, ways like controlling the enemies, slowing them down, slowing down their attack, cast, movement speed. And then there's frailty as well. So let's talk about all three of those. Let's go to chill first. Any damage can chill, not only cold damage. So that's an important thing to note first. So chill reduces attack, cast, movement speed, all three of them by 12%, and it stacks 3 times. So you can debuff the enemy, remove 36% of cast, attack, and movement speed using chill. Chance to slow on hit is not as strong, but it stacks 3 times as well. So slow only affects movement speed as opposed to chill, because chill is all 3 attack, cast, movement speed. So slow is 20% less movement speed, stacks 3 times. It's pretty good. And then frailty. Oh, I don't see frailty in the game guide. Maybe I'm spelling something wrong. Let's load. Oh, we can go loot filter. I'm going to go tunklab.com. So frailty here, I don't know why it's not in the in-game guide. If you have no frailty in your build, then you're not done. Every build needs to have a way of applying frailty to enemies because it's just that song. Frailty, it stacks 3 times here. And the description is 6% less damage. You want to mention less damage taken effects like Flame Ward, Bone Armor, Aspect of the Board. Yeah, so like there's a couple things. We mentioned the Mastery Tree. There's a couple things in here that you would spec into, and like anything that has less damage taken, you know, gain life when this happens. But there's some other things as well, right? What is this? Skill specific stuff. Transplant here, and says, whenever I use Transplant, I'm granted Bone Armor, which grants armor. It grants less damage taken. And each ascendancy, or each class and mastery seems like it has some kind of stuff like this built into it. We've been playing some mages as well, and one of my favorite reasons to be a mage is they have a cooldown, what's called Flame Ward. And Flame Ward can give you damage, percent damage, flat damage. It can give you ward per second or just a big chunk of ward. And it also gives you like reduced damage taken. So things like bone armor, things like flame ward, things like aspect of the boar if you're a primalist. There's all sorts of good things that you can do to buff up whatever your defenses are and whatever those cooldowns are as well. I think we just about covered everything. All right. In any case, we'll keep playing here, but that's like a quick rundown of the defenses that we've prioritized in hardcore here. Probably want to use most of those in softcore as well, but maybe not going as ham as I do, trying to click on every single one. But it feels good. Feels good.